So he'd been a major player in the Gulf War. He'd been a deputy chief of staff in the White House, actually under Rumsfeld, who was the chief of staff in 1975 when Saigon fell and the final crumbling of Vietnam took place. So these guys go way back, and they go back to a pattern of wars in the Republican Party that haven't been terribly auspicious. They go back to Vietnam, that didn't work out well. They go back to the first Gulf War, which wound up being handled inadequately, and people thought that by the end that Bush hadn't been that successful, and now we have what's going on in Iraq. You've got these guys who've been involved in all three. That's over 30 years. And I don't know how the circumstance in Iraq is going to play itself out. But clearly the United States has problems there, and having misjudged it enormously back in May when the president in his flight suit lands on the carrier and does his war dance about how it's mostly over. They didn't understand that the worst was still to come. And maybe the worst is going to lead to civil war, maybe it's not. It may work out decently, but there's also a chance it's going to work out pretty poorly. And if that's the case, then you have to look at Cheney and Rumsfeld and say, you know, this team has been operating before, and it doesn't have the world's greatest success story.
Tell me about your perceptions of the current Republican Party. You had previously worked for an administration, I believe the Nixon administration. Do you get the sense that the Republican Party is happy and supportive of Bush George W.? Because of the Republicans that I do talk to, almost every single one of them says that they had supported him on the last election, and they wouldn't support him this time around.
That's an important enigma. My feeling is that something like 85% of the Republicans support him. It may even be higher than that. Because a lot of people who used to be Republicans or Republican-leaning independents may not consider themselves that anymore, and that affects the way they'd answer a poll. But in parts of the country, New England, New York, the Great Lakes, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, you've got somewhere between 10 and 20% of the Republicans are disaffected. It's not to say they'll all vote against him, but it's conceivable that the 12 to 15% of the Republicans in parts of Washington and Oregon and Northern California and New England are off the reservation. That doesn't mean that anything remotely like that is true nationally, but in certain parts of the country, that may well be the case. I'm not sure that's too great a threat to him, because basically they lost those states the last time out. You can almost win with the South and West together if you throw in a few more northern states like New Hampshire and Indiana. It's enough.
Where do you see your book fitting in with the next election? Are you hoping for a little more press scrutiny of the Bush dynasty?
I'm hoping for it, and I think it'll happen. Now, the question is how much. There's a very major technical inhibition here. Most of these things happened quite a while ago. Most of them happened without a legal proceeding in which testimony was taken or grand juries held hearings or people were subpoenaed. So the record was not finalized at the time. 15, 20 years ago, in the case of some of these things, more than that. There's no way now, with statutes of limitations and people dead and no legal proceedings, that you can establish some of this evidence as legally conclusive evidence. What you have is a lot of circumstantial evidence that tends to support the case that some of these things probably happened, much the way that the family would like them not to have happened. Is all this ever going to be put together in a legally convincing package? I suspect not. Is it going to be put together in a circumstantial evidence package that suggests to the average American that a lot of this stuff must have happened? Well, that is sort of up to the media. I think a lot of this stuff must have happened. I say that as a lawyer. But that doesn't mean it's legally provable, because you don't have all the legal procedures that are necessary to establish something conclusively. So I hope the media do this. I can understand the reticence, but when you have such continuities between the administrations and you have a son who's continuing his father's war and so forth in the same part of the world, I think it's in order for the investigations to go forward of what is probably not conclusively provable back in the late 70s and 80s. I think there's a public policy reason for trying to know what happened there, even if you can no longer produce a legally concrete circumstance.
You have been the author of 11 books. How has the audiences, when you do your book tours, how have they been receptive to this current book? Have you seen an increase in interest in your writing in this particular book?
There's a definite increase. I've gotten some extraordinary attendance at things, and people have come in much greater than anticipated numbers. There's definitely a sense among conservatives and loyalist Republicans, like, this is awful, this is whatever, and so forth. And I guess my position on this is an offshoot of what I just said about it. I think it's important to discuss all these things. But it's also true that on some of these scandals, significant roles were played by Republicans in raising these criticisms of George Bush Sr. The prosecutor, special prosecutor in Iran-Contra, was a Republican deputy attorney general under Eisenhower. Lawrence Walsh. And then Bill Sapphire, who was a Republican White House aide under Nixon, criticized George Bush Sr. so much for Iraqgate that he wrote a column saying that he wouldn't support him. Now, we can't conclusively prove what happened in a legal sense, but there's certainly a lot of reason to think that a lot of Republicans were blunt enough at the time in discussing it, too, that hopefully the body of circumstantial evidence can be built up much more for history, and hopefully it will be.
All right. Any final words you'd like to share with our listeners?
Not really. My sense is this really is an important set of issues, and if these things can all be buried because they're 25 years old or 20 years old and they're no longer susceptible of a legal action or proof, that isn't enough reason to bury them.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
My pleasure.
We've just been talking with Kevin Phillips. He is author of American Dynasty, Aristocracy, Fortune, and the Politics of Deceit in the House of Bush.